We have been working through Matthew's gospel, his story of Jesus' life and the experiences with that. And we're nearing close to the Easter story, the narrative in his gospel where he talks about Jesus' death and his crucifixion and his resurrection. And so we're very close to those experiences. In fact, we're at that point this morning where he's being put on the cross. But I want to kind of focus our attention outside of that. Next week, we'll come back to what is happening to Jesus. And the big question, why did Jesus die? Because it seems so unfair to have somebody who seems to be innocent being put through that. And so it's a big question in people's minds worth taking a look at. So next week, we'll address that. This week, though, I want us to look at some people who are kind of outliers. They're involved in the story, but the spotlight is not on them per se. But they do come in and out of this story, and it is important, and I think we can learn a lot from them personally as well. And the main question I want to put before you is, are these opportunities that come our way in life and these things that happen to us, are they accidents or are they appointments? Or is it a little bit of both? Like, how do we perceive the circumstances of life? Sometimes things that happen to us, they seem very tragic, and maybe they are, or it's just hard to explain. Why would we be put in such a humiliating or difficult position? Why would we have to suffer? And then other times we get into situations and it seems like we receive a blessing that we were never looking for, and it just kind of happens to us. So is that something that just happens? Is it chance or fate? Or is it something more than that? I mean, I don't know that we're going to find a direct answer to that, but that's one thing that we're exploring this morning. Another thing that we're exploring kind of is like, how do we process these kinds of events that happen in our lives that are unexpected? And so we're going to look at two different people in the story. One, he's a man named Simon from a place called Cyrene. And then the other one is, he's a criminal. And he's one of the people being executed beside Jesus in this whole process. So let's look at their lives and see what we can learn from them. Have a few conversations together this morning too. And we're going to be in Matthew chapter 27, looking at two verses, verse 32 and verse 38. The first one focuses on this character Simon. It says, as they were going out, they found a Cyrenian man named Simon. So what's a Cyrenian? Sounds like an alien or something, right? What do you think? If anybody out there know what a Cyrenian is? Yes? Okay, from Cyrene. I heard a Syrian from Cyrene. I mean, you kind of do the etymology on that, and you're like, that sounds plausible. So let's say he's from Cyrene. Where's Cyrene?
North Africa.
Ooh, we got a geography buff in the room or something. It said North Africa. Okay, it is in North Africa. So it's present-day Libya. I'll show you in a map where that star is. It's on the coast, right, just above that on the map. And so you see Egypt with the Nile Delta, and then you see to your right, beyond that, you see Israel and Syria and those nations. And so currently it's in Libya. It's a coastal city, and I'll show you just some pictures from that as well, if we can kind of go through those. These are the ruins of Cyrene. It was not a small place. There's a lot of ruins from the Greek and Roman period, from like late 200s BC or BCE. We see some of these ruins, columns, things of that nature of Greek and Roman architecture. There's amphitheaters that are there. You can go on to the next slide as well. This is a place with some statues to some deities, and parts of the statues are still surviving. So there's like a lot of archaeology. This is the Agora, the marketplace there. And so you can see it wasn't a small place. I mean, this is a built-up place. And just a little bit of the history behind this. The Ptolemies, who were rulers over Egypt, they opened this city up for Jewish settlers a couple hundred years, maybe 200 to 300 years before the time of Jesus. And so there was a large Jewish population that came over there with the promise of Greek citizenship at the time and being involved in how the political structure worked. And again, they were considered parts of society there. But because it's Passover, Jews from all over the world are still coming back to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover feast. And so this is probably just one of many people that came from this place and many other places around the Roman world at the time to celebrate the Passover. And so that's who this individual is, kind of where he's from. We'll talk a little bit more about him in just a moment. But it says they forced him to carry Jesus' cross. And 3 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tell a little bit about this encounter that Simon has with Roman soldiers. And so Jesus, they're getting ready to parade him throughout the city streets and out to a hill called Skull Hill outside the city gates to crucify, to execute him. And so part of this, they try to humiliate and embarrass these people on their way. So he's going to be paraded throughout the city. either because he's weakened from what he's already endured or just because it's policy that day. The Roman soldiers have the ability to just snag anybody. And in Mark's account, it says they forced a man coming in from the country who was passing by to carry Jesus' cross. So this guy's just headed in Jerusalem, probably to buy some things for the Passover meal later that evening, doing some shopping, staying with some relatives out of town who lived outside of the city limits in the country, just coming into town that morning, not expecting anything of it, and bam, a Roman soldier says, "You look like a guy that's strong enough to carry this crossbeam, so you come over here, you take this, and now everything that you had planned is put on hold because you are going to carry this crossbeam behind this criminal or accused criminal, Jesus, and be paraded through the city streets. And so when people mock at him, you're going to face that same sound, screaming, jeering. When people spit at him, you're going to face that same because you're right behind him in this parade. And you're dealing with all this stuff that you never expected. And so in a moment, your plans just get completely rerouted due to circumstances that are totally beyond your control. And maybe you have things like that happen. You've got something planned, you're looking forward to it, you've got the day planned, and something just happens. And it seems like it's just ruined everything, and it's miserable, and it totally wrecks your plans. And that's this person's situation. In Mark 15, it tells us a couple more details about this individual. It says he was Simon of Cyrene, so again, the place identification. But then it tells who his kids were. It says the father of Alexander and Rufus. And then it tells us some more details in Luke. They laid the cross on him to carry it behind Jesus. So he's shouldering this crossbeam behind Jesus. Probably a pretty good-sized guy to be picked out of a crowd by the Roman soldiers to do that. And I think there's something that we miss in this, something I've missed at least. It's really unique, the names that are given to his son, because his name is Simon, it's Shimon, it's a Hebrew name, same as Simon Peter's name. But Alexander's a Greek name. If you remember Alexander the Great, famous Greek general, conquered a lot of territory. So his name is a Greek name. And it's probably due to where this man lives. He lives in Cyrene, which is a Greek colonial city, but it's in the Roman Empire. And so Alexander is a carryover name, indicating the culture. And so this Jewish person is probably not so isolated to the point to only name his kids Jewish names. I mean, he's involved in the city, perhaps in the political scene, and so he's going to name his firstborn son a Greek name. But then what's really interesting here too is that the next name, Rufus, is actually a Latin name. It's a Roman name. And so some scholars theorize, and this is a theory, I can't prove this to you, but that at some point in time between the birth of these two kids, Simon actually became a Roman citizen, which would explain why he would give his son a Roman name. And so it's very plausible that at this point in time, the Roman soldiers just snagged another Roman citizen and forced him to go through this process of carrying the crossbeam. And in one sense, Roman citizenship carried some privileges with it. They weren't supposed to just force Roman citizens to do things like this that were subject to humiliation. In fact, if he had been a Roman citizen from Italy, from that area where Rome is, and soldiers would have treated him this way, it would have been a case for a crime of abuse against him. But since he was Jewish by ethnicity, and since he was from this city that was sort of had Greek foundations in northern Africa instead of from Italy, there was a little more leeway with the soldiers, and his citizenship was a little less meaningful to them. And they probably assumed he didn't have any citizenship in the first place because he probably had Jewish features and characteristics and ethnicity. And so they made a judgment. So obviously in the Roman world, there's prejudice at work, like there's prejudice in our world today that's happening based on ethnicity. And so they didn't think a second. But it's also interesting here because if he was a Roman citizen, Simon, perhaps he could have spoken up and he could have made a case for it. And maybe it was because he thought it was a lost cause. These Roman soldiers, they're not going to care anyway. I'm just going to get beaten for it. They'll ignore me. Or maybe it was because, of another reason, maybe his personal humility. But whatever reason, maybe he took pity on Jesus in that moment and saw. But maybe instead of arguing for his rights, which you could say perhaps he had a right to do, he just embraced this humiliating service, which is another thing that's kind of admirable, but also kind of difficult at the same time. And so he kind of, maybe unknowingly at this point, gives us a beautiful picture of what life in Jesus' kingdom is actually about. And the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, earlier in this book of Matthew, chapters 5, 6, and 7, Jesus was talking, and he said, if somebody forces you to go a mile with him, then go 2. And that was a reference to what's happening to Simon, because at any given moment in time, a Roman soldier could walk up to you and say, here, I want you to carry this burden, this pack, for the next mile, the next Roman mile. And the roads were marked, and so, here, you pack it the next mile. Anybody in the Roman Empire who wasn't a Latin Roman citizen, they could do this to. Or they could say, you have a donkey. No. You're not going where you thought you're going with your donkey. We need that donkey. So for the next mile, you're going with us, and we're going to use your donkey. And if you don't let us, we'll beat you and take your donkey. So you're going to let us. And Jesus was saying, when people do that to you, when somebody comes up to you and says, carry this criminal's cross for a mile, don't just do it for 1 mile, do it for 2. And that's a whole different level. Like, embrace these humiliating tasks where people ignore your rights, in order to show them that there's something that's greater, in order to show them a love that they may have never experienced. And don't just do it for 1 mile, what you're expected to do, but go the extra mile, which we still use that phrase today, right? Go the extra mile. But it's saying do something that you're not required to do, that you're not expected to do, because you care, or because you love, or because you want to show somebody a level of love and humility that they may not experience some other way. And so, for whatever reason, Simon, without putting up an argument, he lets go of his rights. And in doing so, he sets a beautiful picture for us of what we should do and how we should live in similar situations. And it also appears, this is conjecture, so I can't absolutely prove this, but because each of these different gospel writers who were involved in Jesus' life to different degrees, or who heard information from people who were involved with Jesus' life very personally, they each wrote about this instance. It kind of leads you to believe, and especially since this guy's sons' names were included, that this wasn't the end of the story. And I believe what happens is, somehow in this process, Simon actually realizes, and maybe it's not in this moment, maybe it's weeks or months or years later, but I think he actually realized that Jesus is this promised Messiah. Because he is a Jewish person, and for years and years, the Jewish people have expected this coming king, this promised king. And this king was supposed to be a forever king. This king was supposed to be an example of the image of God that people were created to be, that people failed to be, because we failed. We decided, I can define good and bad and the right treatment of people and the right treatment of God my own way. So I've got a handle on this, God. I don't need your opinion or assistance with this. But this Messiah was supposed to be somebody who correctly represented God, who was humble, who didn't make the same moral mistakes and failures, who didn't mistreat people, who didn't victimize people with injustice. And again, in a moment like this, I don't know if this was the moment, or if watching the crucifixion play out was the moment, or if it was conversations or interactions with church leaders later at some point in time. But because these writers include him in the story, and because they mention his sons by name, it's almost an inference that somehow there's a connection. So when people are reading these accounts, they recognize, oh yeah, Simon, yeah, we've heard about him. Or, oh yeah, Simon, his sons, like we've heard about them. Or maybe they're even in our church. And again, this is kind of a leap. I can't prove that this was the exact outcome, but that's a hypothesis that I'm going to make because of how they're mentioned. It's also interesting that in the book of Romans, there's a gentleman named Rufus who is referred to in that book. And again, that's something that can't be linked for certain. It doesn't say Rufus, the son of Simon the Cyrene. That would give us more detail. But it's interesting that Mark's gospel, at least according to some early church leaders, about 150 to 200 AD, they actually spoke of how Mark's gospel was written in the city of Rome, which would be interesting because if you put Mark in the city of Rome mentioning a guy named Rufus in his letter, and then Paul, when he writes the letter to the Romans, saying, greet this person named Rufus, it puts people in the right positions to make a conjecture like that. Again, that's not absolutely provable, but I think it at least makes us wonder, is there more to the story? Did Simon and perhaps his sons become known in the church because they came to faith in Jesus as well? And if so, was this an accident that he was ripped off the side of the road and forced to carry a cross and experience all those things that he didn't sign up for that day? Or was it actually some kind of a divine appointment? Makes us think. And if it was with him, what kind of divine appointments does God put in our lives? And maybe these things aren't so pleasant, But maybe it's going to lead us or somebody else in our lives through those experiences to a place where they'll have a close encounter with Jesus. And maybe that'll be something that changes their lives. And it's always sudden and unexpected, it seems like. So how do you know? But isn't that, it can be exciting. But at the same time, it can alter our plans, change our plans. The second person that I want to take a look at this morning, it's a few verses past this. And it's a rebel. And I got a few questions for you as we look at this rebel. So it says in verse 38, 2 criminals were crucified with Jesus, one on the right and one on the left side. And just to give you an idea, so the Bible uses a word for criminal in the New Testament. And if you translate it literally, it means somebody who's in the business of bad. So that's what a criminal is. They're in the business of bad. So it's not just somebody who offended somebody or made a Roman soldier mad. This is kind of maybe career criminal is a little harsh, but they're definitely involved in some shady things that they shouldn't be. And this is what their regular business is, that's kind of the realm that they operate in. So that's how this person is described. Luke gives us more insight. Matthew basically just says this is the fact, and some of them were jeering Jesus. But in Luke tells us a few more interesting pieces of information about these 2 criminals. Luke says, one of the criminals hanging there began to yell insults at Jesus. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and save us. So what does this first criminal think about Jesus? Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. What do you think? What does he think about Jesus? You can answer. He's a fraud, yeah. Aren't you supposed to be this Messiah? Aren't you in the same situation we're in? Yeah. Anything else? What does he think about Jesus? Didn't believe in him. Okay? Is he showing Jesus some respect and dignity in that moment? No? Just mocking him, right? Yeah.
Actually, he's just trying to save himself. The selfish attitude is coming.
Maybe he's saying, if you're the Messiah, it's about time. Yeah. Because it seems like with those words, he's saying, if you really were who you claim to be, first of all, you would be saving us from Rome right now, not hanging here. And secondly, if you really are, because they had this idea that the Messiah was more than just a human. This Messiah was like the perfect, the human who was living out the way that humans were supposed to. And even several Old Testament scriptures equate this person, this figure, with God, like with God himself, with equality with God or being God. And so you would think that one who was making a claim that I am God who showed up in human form would definitely not be somebody, being subjected to death. And if they were, one, they better have an escape route coming up pretty quickly. And if that's the case, why don't you just save us in the process? Because if you can do all these divine things and these miracles that we've heard about, why don't you just get us off here right now too and magically transport us into some great place like this never even happened? Because couldn't you do that? And that's how he feels. He believes Jesus is fake. He's a fraud. He's a pretender. But then it says the other one, and we'll take a look. I want you to listen to these words closely because the next question is going to be, what's the second criminal think? What's he believe about Jesus? It says the other one answered, rebuking the first, don't you even fear God since you're undergoing the same punishment? We are punished justly because we're getting back what we deserve for the things we did. But this man has done nothing wrong. And then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. What's the second criminal thinking? What's going through his mind?
Jesus is God.
Why do you think that?
Because what he asked.
Okay, Gene said Jesus is God because of what he asked. Yeah, remember me when you come into your kingdom? That's a pretty bold ask when this person's about to die right next to you, right? This person, either they're coming back or there's something beyond or something, but there's something greater. So what do you think the second criminal, how is he processing this? His own, what does he believe about himself? What does he believe about Jesus? What's going on in his head?
Thinking of eternity.
Thinking of eternity. Okay, sure. Thinking about what's next. Anybody else? What's going on in his mind? What do you think? Because we're just kind of spitballing here, right? Yeah.
He deserves the punishment he's getting.
Okay, so he thinks he deserves the punishment he's getting. Yeah, he does. He's like, you know what? We're in the business of bad here. This is what people who do bad for business, I mean, this happens, right? Can't argue.
Seems like he had a certain understanding of the kingdom of God that Jesus came proclaiming.
Yeah, he did. Maybe he's got Jewish background. We don't know everything, but he knows when there's this talk about the kingdom and when the other criminal on the other side is saying, if you're the king, if you're the Messiah, why don't you come down and save us too? And everybody's yelling that. Like, he seems to have some kind of background knowledge of this. Like, this Jesus was proclaiming some sort of kingdom, and he is this figure, this promised forever king. Like, he seems to have landed on that. Yeah.
He is ready to give up.
He's ready to give up. Okay.
Give up his life.
Why do you think that? I mean, it's happening, obviously, but
He is accepting Christ.
he's accepting Christ. Okay. So maybe he's kind of at the end where he realizes, this is my only hope, perhaps. Yeah. One other person in the back. Did you have?
He knows that he can't earn grace. That even though he was a criminal, he can have grace.
Interesting. You said he knows he can't earn grace. He's asking for it. Yeah. And I think maybe there's a couple ways to look at it, because he does say, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And on the one hand, he could just be thinking, well, like, I'm so bad. I'm obviously not going to be part of Jesus' kingdom. So if you just remember me, like, I don't know what's happening to me. I'm dying, but who knows what's happening after this. Maybe it's just the grave. Like, I don't deserve to be in some kingdom. Perhaps he's going that route and saying, just remember me, because, I'll be forgotten otherwise. Or maybe when he's saying, remember me, he's somehow connecting that with, would you invite me into that kingdom as well? Yeah, I don't know his heart, but that's a possibility. What Deborah said as well is, this is an ask. It's saying, Jesus, like, I believe who you are, and your identity is this Messiah, which is pretty unbelievable because they're both going to die, obviously. And so for him to make that claim when everyone else in the area thought that the Messiah would not die, would conquer Rome, and that's how Israel would be brought back with God again, that's what they expected this figure to do. So for some criminal who's been about the business of bad to make that conclusion when the theologian standing there mocking Jesus landed on a completely different page about what they expected. That's a pretty astounding thing. And somehow he just makes this realization, it seems like, in the moment about Jesus. He thinks Jesus is innocent, whereas he's guilty. He thinks Jesus has power over death because if he's about to die and he's coming into a kingdom, something's got to happen. Either this is an eternal kingdom, but the Jews had an idea that there was a physical element involved as well. And so he thinks Jesus has power here, some divine power, and then he thinks Jesus is going to receive a kingdom. And, what he assumes about himself, either I need what this Jesus is and what he has, or, I maybe don't even have a chance. We don't know exactly what's going on in his heart. But this is a good reminder that Jesus' kingdom is filled with unexpected surprises. And many people who come into it are not the ones that we would expect. We expect the people who have studied the religious books and the texts to be the first people in line. But the first people in line are the people who have ignored God's maybe morality or desires or written words, maybe throughout most of their lives. Maybe they have a background as kids or something, but they've ignored that. And then they get brought into this moment of realization, even toward the end, that, no, I really do realize who this Jesus is. What Jesus says next really, I think, shows us how amazing that is. Jesus' last words to this individual, the ones that are recorded at least in the Bible, it says, and Jesus said to him, the second criminal, truly I tell you, today you'll be with me in paradise. Today you'll be with me in paradise. And so even if he was hopeless in that moment, Jesus just gave him some hope. That's pretty amazing. When you think of paradise, what do you imagine? What do you picture when you think of paradise? Anybody out there have paradise in mind?
No worries, mate.
No worries, mate. Okay. No worries in paradise. What else do you think of when you think of paradise? Garden of Eden, okay. What else? I mean, you're going to paradise. Where are you going? What's it going to look like, smell like? People will be there. Paradise by yourself just isn't paradise, okay? And you're thinking a little bit too spiritual maybe. Like, what do you think of when you think of paradise? Like, if you're going to take a flight to paradise, what kind of place would you land? A beach, the Caribbean, okay? Anybody else? Everybody going to the Caribbean? No evil there, okay. Yeah, no lawlessness or evil or people taking advantage of each other. Yes. Lots of good food. Hey, yeah, that's paradise, right? The buffet is open. Yeah. Yeah, these are the kinds of ideas we get when we think of paradise. So maybe each of us would refine that a little bit, for ourselves from our own perspective. But what is paradise in the Bible? What is paradise in the Bible? The Bible does talk about paradise. What is it in the Bible? What do you think, or what do you know, or what do you guess? Okay, no worries. What is paradise? Being in God's presence, okay. No pain, all right. What is paradise in the Bible? Yes?
Isn't there a level of heaven?
A level of heaven. Okay, a level of heaven. We're going to talk about that in just a second, but I think that's on the right track as well. A level of heaven. Yeah. Any other thought? Yes.
The only other time this word paradise is used is in reference to the garden, like the Garden of Eden.
Okay. So we already heard somebody earlier say paradise is the Garden of Eden. So maybe it's right that we connect that. There's a couple places besides here where paradise is referred to in the Bible. And let's just start at the beginning. One of them is definitely the Garden of Eden. And we call it the Garden of Eden, but the text actually says a garden in Eden. So God forms this garden in Eden, and that's where he lands the humans and where he forms them. And so Eden means paradise. So we have a garden in paradise. And so when we think about the Garden of Eden, we should think about things in terms of if God wanted to set a baseline for paradise, this is kind of what it would involve. And so you have different things in Eden. You have this beautiful river that makes sure everything is well watered, that flows right out from the garden or through the garden. Plenty of water, plenty of life. It's lush, it's green. You have all these fruit trees of every kind imaginable everywhere. And so you have this beauty, lush beauty, but you also have the buffet, the food. And everything except for one of them is completely open. Everything is on except for one that's off limits. So you have this amazing variety of food. And you also have these humans, the first man and woman that God makes in the story. They're walking and they're having conversation with God. It says God is walking in the cool of the evening or in the evening breeze, and they're meeting together. So they have this experience in God's presence. So somebody mentioned that. And really, when you think in terms of heaven, a part of what you're thinking is like, the place where God is. And so you could make an argument that where God is, that is heaven, to a degree, in a sense. And so all these things are kind of representative of the Garden of Eden. And you also have two people, and they're in a great relationship with each other. And you see that because of what happens when the people choose to go their own way. And God has put some boundaries in place, one, and they cross the boundary because they think, they've got a better plan. And once that happens, the first thing that happens is people start blaming each other. And so you have Adam and Eve, and they're blame shifting, right? And they realize there's some rift between us, and they don't want to be fully seen by each other. And so they're trying to sew fig leaves together and cover themselves up because they feel vulnerable and they feel like they're known and their secrets are known and their failures and flaws are suddenly known. And there's blame, and we don't want blame on us. And all this relational disharmony all of a sudden starts to happen. And so Eden is the place where none of that happens. And that's the picture we get. As we forward through the Old Testament, we're introduced to a tabernacle and a temple. And a lot of the ways that the temple is designed, with the curtains, with the furnishings, all those things are throwbacks to Eden. You have some of the same jewels used in the priest outfit that are mentioned in the Garden of Eden. You have the gold that's mentioned with Eden. You have some of the fruits and the cherubim who are connected with Eden, the angelic type creatures. And so all that is kind of this heaven on earth spot, the spot where you can experience God's presence, little portal from heaven down to earth. And so that's like a mini Eden because of what it's supposed to create, a place where you can actually come close to God's presence, draw near him again. And then when you look at Revelation, where things end with this new world, this new heaven and new earth, where a city comes down from God, you see those same types of Eden images again, with God's presence and people and God being together again. That's where the story ends. And with that, you find the word paradise. It's connected with paradise. And so that's what you get. And so when Jesus says, today you're going to be with me in paradise, that's what Jesus means. That's what Jesus means. But how is it possible for somebody who's in the business of bad to enter into paradise? This place that doesn't have any of that bad associated with it. You know, how is that possible? And that's the question that we get left with. Matthew doesn't answer it. He doesn't even say it, but it's implied. Why is this person in the story? Why did Luke include these extra details in his story? And what are we supposed to take away from that? Because it's like that question that's asked that's just left open-ended and hanging. And when you read through it, you think, oh, this is just what happened. And, you know, maybe you read through it 10 or 20 times and you're like, oh, that's cool, that happened. And then one day when you're reading through it, you think, well, how is that possible? How can this guy who's all about criminal activity end up in paradise with Jesus the same day? How's that work? And that's a question that we're supposed to hang on to. And I think an answer that we find more next week when we look at Jesus and the reason why he came to die in the first place. And so I want to leave you with that question. Think about that this week. How is it possible for somebody with a criminal past and a criminal present up until this moment to end up in paradise, this good place with Jesus? How's that possible? So, you know, again, an important question for us to linger on this week. I'm going to go ahead and close in prayer, but before I do, again, we have these things that happen in life, you know, and sometimes we're just recruited in. We don't plan on it. We don't volunteer. Circumstances just force us, or they tell us, or people tell us, this is the way it's going to be. But is it possible that God actually allows those things or even orchestrates those things because he has something important in mind? Maybe it's some work and some growth that he wants to bring about in our lives. Maybe it's a perspective he wants to give us. Maybe it's an opportunity he wants to open up for us through that experience. And then on the opposite end, God seems to have this way of reaching out to rebels. And maybe we feel like we have no part in paradise. We've done so many things, or we've had a past that just disqualifies us. And this is a good reminder that that is not the case. And that whatever Jesus came to do and accomplish, part of it was to make a way for any of us to be with him in a place that he calls paradise. Even somebody with the shadiest of pasts. Isn't that interesting? But that's part of God's grace.